Thanks very much. Well, it's a great joy to be here. It's very nice to be back in carer land. I was president of the Australian Council of Social Services back in the 90s, and one of our most valuable members, most informed members, and most keenly agitative members, if I can use that expression in terms of getting their way, were in fact Carers Australia. And so it's lovely to be here. Let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, but today actually I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous carers who have done a great job in keeping so many children and other people in their community safe and well in periods of time and times when it's been very tough to do so, and I acknowledge this very much. Sometimes we only look at the negative side of everything, and in the Indigenous space it was my experience that most of the conferences I went to only looked at the negative side, and it was right that we do so. But the vast majority of children never went into care. The vast majority of Aboriginal people do work. The vast majority of people pass on their skills, their traditions, their ancestral heritages to the next generation. And we should be proud that so many have achieved so much. And today is a good day to acknowledge that as well. When do you become invisible? When do you as an individual, as a group of people, cease to in fact be visible to the rest of society? Why I raise that question is that when you talk to older Australians, and I'm almost about that, a couple of years off it, and the technical definition of that is over 65 years of age, but for Indigenous people over 50, they get special mention there. They say to me, I feel invisible. I feel that I've shrunk, that nobody notices me, nobody cares. And in a sense, if you look at abuse more generally of groups around Australia, it's always the invisible that are subject to the greatest abuse. I just recently spent 5 years dealing with child sexual abuse in institutions. And what was the greatest lesson out of that was our failure to see and to listen to children. If only we had listened to children. But for years and years, we didn't. We really didn't see them, and we certainly didn't hear them. And if they were in boys' homes or girls' homes, in orphanages, if they were tucked away in institutions which were not subject to scrutiny, the world simply assumed that they were safe. The Royal Commission showed that our most trusted institutions, whether they're faith-based or government, whether they were secular or otherwise, failed. But we as a society failed. Our criminal justice system, our civil justice system, our child protection systems, society failed, and we failed because we didn't see and hear children. In relation to disability, before the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabled, where were they in the Australian landscape? They were hidden, voiceless. They were hidden away in sheltered workshops, in activity centres, in large-scale institutions, or tucked away in families who wouldn't even acknowledge that they had children with disabilities. One of the most tragic cases of that was an ethnic family, a family from a particular culture, and I visited an institution on the south coast. This is some years ago near Wollongong, and it was an institution that had children permanently. And there was a child who could neither see nor hear, that had no sensory perceptions at all, zero. It wasn't comatose, wasn't in coma, but had no sensory. And she had one visitor, and the visitor was the mother. But the mother had told the rest of the family that the child had died. And so the child was now 7 or 8, lived much longer than anyone expected, and yet in that culture she could not acknowledge to the rest of her family that the child was born with a disability. And I wonder whether that was really all that rare and extreme. And so today, when we come to look at the safeguarding of older Australians and people with disability, the area that I've now got the Commission in, it is about the invisibility of people. The way we keep people safe is not to allow them to be invisible, not to allow them to be voiceless. And as carers, you are the agent for that. You are the agents that bring to life and keep alive that presence in the world of all of those people that are vulnerable. If we look at abuse of older people and people with disabilities, most people don't abuse them out of ill intent. What's very clear in the work that I've now got, which is to try to prevent and respond to abuse of older Australians and of adults with disability in New South Wales, that abuse is generally born out of other factors. The vast majority of abuse of older Australians in New South Wales is by their sons and daughters, and sometimes their carers, who in a sense start off being helpful. We'll help mum do the internet banking. We'll help mum negotiate with the suppliers. And then a funny thing happens. They say, well, I'm sure mum would want to help out the grandchildren today, wouldn't she? And I'm sure mum wouldn't want me to struggle today. After all, she's going to leave us some money later on. And then it changes to, oh, but mum doesn't actually need that much. She's spending most of the time at home. And over time, helpful behaviour becomes harmful behaviour, becomes abuse and exploitation, and becomes a crime. In the place of disability, do we really believe that people, many people, set out to abuse people with disabilities? Well, some do. Just the same as some did to children. It's just the same as some do to other people in their own family. But the vast majority don't. They start off by a frustration because of simply living with a person with disabilities and the difficulties that encounters in their life. Most families with children with disabilities break up at some stage. There's very little extended family support, especially when the child becomes a difficult teenager or even more a troublesome adult. And the frustration of a system that doesn't quite work so well. And again, caring behaviour becomes harmful behaviour, becomes abuse. And in the world of disability, it's most often inappropriate restraints, both chemical and physical restraints of people with disability. And of course, as you would well know, a restraint, an unauthorised restraint, is in fact an assault under criminal law. How much of that happens today? And where is the place of greatest danger? Is it in the aged care facility? Is it in a disability group home? Is it in a hospital setting? Well, abuse takes place in all of those settings, that's true. And the Royal Commissions that you're seeing in relation to aged care and disability will focus on those settings. But you know, the truth of the matter is they're not the place of highest risk at all. The greatest risk for people with disabilities and for older people is in their own family home. And that is both through the service provision by home care, whether it is in fact nursing care or others, where there's no line of sight. It is in fact the person in need and in fact the carer, either paid or professional or otherwise. Whereas in residential institutions, whether they're aged or disability, there is a line of sight. Over time, bad conduct gets picked up. Now, it may happen too late, and many relatives of yours and others may in fact be exposed to unnecessary risks and dangers and harms. But overwhelmingly, those systems respond, particularly now. But in the home, it's a very different space. And we as a society have not yet worked out how to have a safeguarding regime that affects the huge number of people within their own home that are receiving services there. If I can just break it up into two parts for a moment and then talk about my own new role. In relation to institutions, how do we keep people safe? Well, it's firstly to recognise their rights. And rights matter. Rights matter a great deal. If we start by simply talking about the quality of the services and the safeguarding regimes, we fail entirely to understand what's happening. Children should have had rights. They did have rights and they do have rights. And so too do older people and so too do people with disabilities. And as carers concerned about their well-being, that's where we start. We acknowledge it, we proclaim it and we live it out. We don't back off it. It is about rights. It's about your rights and my rights. And in my Act, I have 4 or 5 or 6 rights that I am required to try to preserve for people. And I'll come back to those in a moment. But the second thing is a culture. What we've discovered in the Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse, that the greatest problem in institutions, whether they were government, religious or otherwise, was a failure of leadership, governance and culture. They were not cultures that embedded the notion of child safety into them. Values galore, but actually a culture. And today the same is true in our facilities that look after older people and people with disabilities. Or those they encounter, such as hospitals and healthcare, or transport services, or whatever they may be. Is there a culture that embraces safety? Now you might say, well, that's very hard to achieve. Just let's pause for a moment and look at workplace health and safety. Today, we have done an extraordinary thing. When I was growing up and I was, as a youngster, but also as a young lawyer, We accepted in our society that people would go to work and come back injured or not come back at all and died. We accepted that. And it was almost guaranteed that if you're in the trades, that would occur. Today, because we've changed the way in which we think about the issue of safety, we've changed the regulations. Every organisation has risk management approaches to dealing with safety. We think safety. When you walked into this building, I'm sure you had a safety right at the beginning of the day. And it's second nature to us. When it started, businesses around Australia, which is what they always do, said the world's going to fall in. You know, every time you do something in Australia, business says the world's going to fall in. Well, it didn't. But what did happen is fewer people got injured and even fewer people died. And today we think safety. So if you're running an agency, whatever agency it is, an organisation, whether it's in health or transport, residential care, you have to have a culture that thinks safety. And you have to embrace the processes and the policies that makes clear. And so that's where we've got to get to in terms of safety of older people and people with disabilities in institutions. But what about in the home, where the carers are so important? Earlier this year, I did a review when I stood with the Productivity Commission of the National Disability Agreement, which is an agreement between the 9 governments. And we identified one of the emerging gaps was about the support of carers of people with disability, to recognise their own needs and their own rights independent of the needs of the person with a disability receiving NDIS care. And I hope that comes to fruition. But we also acknowledge more generally the role of the carer in terms of the safety of the individuals. So this commission that I now head up is in fact brand new. It doesn't exist anywhere else in Australia. It's a sort of a halfway house between a public advocate and an ombudsman's office. And what it's focused on is in fact preventing and responding to abuse, neglect and exploitation of older Australians and adults with disabilities in New South Wales. And as I said to you, I fully understand and appreciate that abuse very often is something that comes over time and often from what was otherwise a helpful start. But I'm required under this Act to identify particularly abuse within the family home in the community setting. So whilst anybody that's older or anybody with a disability is in my jurisdiction, and that's a lot of you and a lot of me, in fact, my concentration is in the family home. So I refer matters to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. I refer matters to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. I refer matters to the Healthcare Complaints Commission, for example. But what I do look at are those where the abuse is likely to have occurred by a person known to the actual person at risk. And fragility and risk go together. Fragility, dependency and risk. So some of these rights, very briefly if I can, the rights to respect for their, adults with disability and older Australians have the right to respect for their worth and dignity as individuals, to live life free from abuse, neglect and exploitation. They have the right to respect for their cultural and linguistic diversity, age, gender, sexual orientation and religious beliefs. They have a right to privacy and confidentiality. How many older people maintain those rights? They have a right to exercise choice and control in the pursuit of their own goals and planning. And lastly, it says families and carers and other significant persons have a crucial role in the lives of adults with disability and older adults. And it is important to respect and preserve those relationships. You know, the business I'm in is rights and relationships. Now, it seems odd, doesn't it, with an organisation that has fundamentally got all these powers. I've got the powers to investigate matters that are reported through our helpline, the Aged and Disability Helpline. I have powers to send matters to the police. I have powers to issue search warrants, to enter premises. I have powers to run public inquiries with the powers of a Royal Commissioner. I have all those powers. But you know, at the end of the day, my biggest job is how do I keep people safe? So yes, I want to hold people to account that do the wrong thing, but that's secondary to actually keeping people safe. How do I do that? And I do that because you will become the eyes and ears of the Commission effectively. In many senses, when this commission was established, people carers and people service providers thought it was all about oversighting them. Well, it is to the extent that carers do abuse people. Paid, professional, family members. Of course, you know that, and I know that. As a society, we don't want to believe it, but you and I know it to be true. But the truth of the matter is, to do my job will be for you to see things and come forward. And so home care workers, people that are in residential services, people that are in the healthcare system, people are neighbours, people that are relatives, they're the ones that come forward to report something, or at least to raise an inquiry. And so our helpline is not just about taking formal reports, it's about helping people to understand the signs, to talk through the issues, and more often than not, to try to change the relationships from relationships that are unsafe to relationships that are safe. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to have to do that by working with every organisation and service provider and every instrument of government that is available to us. So I can go to NCAT and seek a guardianship order where it has gone to a point that the person is incapable of looking after their own affairs. I can work with the police, if necessary, to do safety and wellbeing checks, and ultimately, if necessary, to aid in the prosecution. I don't prosecute, obviously. But the vast majority will be about trying to re-establish relationships that are safe for the person living in their own home and in their family circumstances. So what can't I become? I can't become a child protection agency for older people. That would be catastrophic. I can't be the police. There's 60 new aged crime prevention officers being appointed. And I can't be a welfare agency. And yet all of those elements are present. So you and I will work together to help shape what this body will be. But I can tell you this, I will be fierce in the protection of the rights of older people and people with disabilities. That's what I'm required to do, but that's what I want to do. But to do that, we need to be at one. Carers have an extraordinarily important role in the support of all people that are vulnerable in our community. I value carers. Nobody needs to convince me of the worth or value of carers. In fact, people like yourself and others have spent a lifetime educating me of that. In fact, I used to have big arguments with Carers Australia about how much they wanted to be paid through the DSS and the welfare system. And we had all those arguments. But the one thing that is not in doubt is your value. Your value to society, the gift of caring, the act of caring in and of itself is a positive and a common good. But we do have to be realistic. So how will the Carers Association of New South Wales and of Australia actually create a safeguarding regime for their carers? How will they shape these issues that I've presented to you in a way that doesn't alienate carers but engages them in the common pursuit of keeping people safe? How will we ensure that what is intended in my Act in relation to the protection of these rights actually matters? Those rights are contested. There are carers here today and there are carers in your association that have real difficulties with the notion of choice. They don't quite get what that should be like. And they don't, in the end of the day, necessarily trust those that they're caring for to be able to exercise those choices. And sometimes people make bad choices. So too do people with disabilities and so too do older Australians. So these rights are contested in the way in which they're actually managed. So let me conclude, because I'm very conscious of your time and I want to take a few questions, to just simply say this commission, the Ageing Disability Commission, is here. It is the first of its kind in Australia. Whether or not the Royal Commission into Disability or the Royal Commission into Aged Care make further recommendations that make this sort of approach a national approach, I don't know. But we are around. We're in Parramatta. We have outreach into the regional areas. And we are dealing with multiple agencies, service providers, advocacy groups already. And it's only just almost 100 days into our existence. So we're just at the start of the journey. But it's a journey that I ask you to come with me on. Help me do my work and I will help you do your work. And together we might be able to keep older Australians and adults with disabilities safer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if there's any questions for Robert.
Yes. I like questions. Who's going to ask the first one? There we are. Thank you.
It's really good to hear that you exist, and I'm pleased that you're this far down the track and you've still got some passion in your voice.
Only for a few more years left.
Yes. Yeah, until the rhetoric kicks in. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that, look, everything you said is, look, I don't think anyone can disagree with that. I just wanted to raise the issue, and I've raised it a number of times everywhere I go, but just for people to think about the fact that carers are often not safe, and nobody hears them when you ring the coppers and, my son is, just got out of wherever and has abused me. They don't see it as domestic violence often,
Sure.
or whatever it may be. Particularly around mental health, it's not taken seriously, and I hope that would be part of somebody's responsibility for educating people around the fact that, regardless of a disability, violence is not good either way.
So can I just make the comment about that? I'm very much aware that in relation to people, particularly people with disabilities, that is exactly true, that in fact there can be cases where the carers and other family members are subjected to violence by people with disabilities, and we know that. The challenge, I think, for the service system as a whole is to respond to that issue that you've got in a way that de-escalates so that, in fact, it doesn't then become a counter abuse. And what we see in abuse of people with disabilities is often it's born out of enormous frustration and maybe safety. And of course, the community doesn't understand that at all. They see and they have their idealised version of a person with a disability or whatever it might be. And so we've got to be clever and smarter about reacting to that. So this is where I think the sensitivity is. I think my job is about dealing with relationships that have gone bad, maybe because of the very reasons you've indicated. The bigger challenge is then, what is the response? What are the sort of supports we've got to put in place so that your son with a disability doesn't have his rights infringed, but he's also in a position where you're safe and your rights are protected? And I don't think we understand that well enough. But I can tell you for sure and certain we're very much aware of it where we are. And these are not black and white issues. This is a space which is full of greyness. I just hope we have the intelligence and the thoughtfulness to be, considerate of those sorts of issues, of which I'm acutely aware. So hold us to account. But I do actually understand and appreciate very much your own issue. I might also say not all older people are nice people either. Some older people, some of you are here, are pretty grumpy old coots and a bit difficult. So this is not a world in which, the person with the disability is always right or vice versa. That would be a silly and childish way to see it. And it is complex. Having said that, our focus obviously is in relation to ensuring that people with disability and older people are free from harm, and that's our key focus. But it's not devoid of that sort of knowledge, so thank you for that. Other questions?
Robert, thank you for a wonderful presentation today, and look, we are so thrilled that it should be you who's the Commissioner. It's a great achievement for New South Wales, and we're sure that you're going to do us well. But I've got two questions really. The first one is about your jurisdiction.
Yes.
I suppose, and a comment, I suppose, but I add that too. So the first one's about the jurisdiction. We know that a lot of the issues that upset the New South Wales Minister for Ageing last year were about incidents in residential care in New South Wales. They were publicised through the Four Corners program. What's your jurisdiction in a program that's funded federally? Maybe it's better if I stop at that point and I'll come back to that.
So the jurisdiction is this. All older people, all adults with disabilities in New South Wales are in my jurisdiction. That's that wide. If a matter can be the nature of a complaint, if the matter can form a complaint in relation to a Commonwealth agency such as the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, or the equivalent in aged care, or the healthcare complaints with the New South Wales body, I'm compelled to refer it to those. So they get out. Where it gets tricky is this, two ways. The first one is if the abuse is occurring by a family member or a non-staff member. So let's assume that the older person is in an aged care facility and that the family member is financially abusing or exploiting that individual, or alternatively actually psychologically or physically damaging, it's in my jurisdiction. Because fundamentally the aged care system will look after what's happening by the staff and the volunteers in that service. So I won't complicate it further than to say that. But there is one other area. On the midnight, I wasn't involved in any of the legislation. The legislation passed on the Thursday night and I became Commissioner on the Monday morning. But at Thursday night, they added a change to the legislation that said, notwithstanding that I send these matters to other agencies, I can still deal with them, which meant they all went out, they all came back in. And, and I've got to work so they all go back out again. But I can actually intervene in some cases. And there will be circumstances where there will be a joint investigation in relation to those residential services. But fundamentally, if there is a government agency that deals with complaints in relation to that service, the first port of call will be back to those other services, such as health. I'll navigate that for the person. They don't have to navigate that. We'll do that for them.
Okay, look, two questions. The one is about your very valid and very useful point about much abuse starts off from good intentions, from loving family members who often, for various reasons, take on more than they can manage and their own circumstances change, etc. Some of the research shows that indeed carers are often their own worst enemies. They so engaged in caring, they forget to care for themselves. Sure. And it's very useful to call for the help of carers in identifying the problem, but what sort of work might we do to try and help people identify the limits of their own capacity to care and their own rights to call in other assistance?
Well, I think you've identified the next project. In fact, I'm sure this is being done. The rights of carers and the needs of carers, I fully acknowledge. The question is, how do you actually operationalise that? And that's about systems and services and supports. And I'm sure in relation to the New South Wales Carers Plan and the national one, they should be parts of those plans. So I can't assist you with that. I think you know what that's about. But you have to be safe in order to be able to care. So let me make the comment again. We recognise that supporting carers in and of themselves is important. When the NDIS came in, you'd be aware that there was a view by some in the disability sector that the carer issues should be dealt with exclusively through the eyes of and the care plans of the person with disability. Now that is true. But what became very clear, and I think it was clear before then, that carers have rights and needs in and of themselves, just by the nature of caring. And I'm hopeful now that the NDIS has been sort of around for 5 years, both the Commonwealth and the state governments are attentive to those separate needs, and then they pick up your points. So what do you, if you're going to have a safeguarding arrangement for older people and people with disabilities, I think an extremely important part is what about carers? What about their safety? How do they contribute to a safe environment? And I think a lot of the work we do will help feed into the considerations around that. I just don't have the answers yet, and it would be presumptuous.
It's a hard question,
to do so. And it may be that you're already working on those things.
Just the third one was you very confidently said that it's domestic abuse. Sorry, do you have statistics on that?
On what?
That domestic abuse is greater in incidence and rate than abuse of people who are highly dependent in residential
So
care.
we don't have...
I don't know those statistics.
We don't have prevalence rates.
No.
Although in the aged care area and in the NDIS there will be figures starting to emerge very substantially, but they're not prevalence rates. So that's the first thing I want to be very careful about. The Commonwealth Government believes that there is research that's been done in Australia, and there's probably researchers here that are aware, that the rate of abuse of older people is somewhere between 2 and 8%, which is a very large field. The Commonwealth Government chooses a figure of 5%. They say that 5% of older Australians are being abused, and that equates to about 185 to 190,000 people in any 1 year. Now, I don't want to verify those facts, but that's their estimate, and it's the only estimate we have. But we don't have prevalence data at this stage. No. Yeah. Any other questions? We're finished.
We'll probably have to
finish.
leave it there, but I think that was... And we are doing some training with the Commission. Carers New South Wales is doing some training with Commission staff later this year, which will also be great. So I'd like you to thank Robert Fitzgerald.
Thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.